Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's expert lecture, which is the first of a two-part series on the Cold War, delivered by our expert guest speaker, Major Gordon Corrigan. Now, you may be aware that we've had a little break from webinar activity recently, and that was following the very sad loss of our Managing Director, Marina Linker, who sadly passed away at the start of the year, and we just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who sent their kind and thoughtful messages of condolence to us over the last couple of months. It's brought a great comfort to our company president Tim Littler and the rest of the Golden Eagle Luxury Trains family. So on behalf of everyone, we'd just like to say thank you for that. Now, for those of you who've met Marina and had travelled with her, you'll know that she was absolutely dedicated to providing world-class experiences on board our luxury trains. And the onboard lecture programmes that we deliver are very much a part of that experience. But obviously, whilst we're not operating our tours for the minute, we are providing these expert lectures to you virtually. All of the sessions are recorded and are available on our YouTube channel for you to watch back at your own leisure. So today's lecture will also be available from tomorrow. So with that being said, it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's expert lecturer, Major Gordon Corrigan, who, if you've watched any of his previous lectures or have travelled with us previously, you will know that he has the ability to bring historic events to life with his captivating storytelling. So I am absolutely sure that you will love today's lecture. Now, as always, we'd love to get involved with the session. So if you do have any questions, then please feel free to send them through at any time during the presentation using the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do as best as we can to answer those at the end. So I hope you enjoy, and I will hand over to Major Corrigan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha, and good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're watching this from. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Kent, and we're still on lockdown. And I must say that when I first talked to Golden Eagle travellers in May last year, I did little thought that we'd still be doing it almost a year later. But we will get back on the rail eventually, and it'll be so much fun when we do. Now, we're still on lockdown here, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm badly in need of a haircut. I'm told that the barbers will reopen on the 21st of April. So until then, please forgive my rather shaggy appearance. This is the first of two talks. Normally on the Golden Eagle, I talk about specifics of the area that we're in. I'm going to widen the perspective a bit for these two lectures because I want to talk about the Soviet Union's relation with the rest of the world, specifically in view of the Cold War. Now, if you're 45 or older, you grew up under the Cold War. And the Cold War, the foundation of the Cold War was laid in Yalta. The Yalta Conference was 8 days in February 1945. And it shaped the world for the next 50 years. And we still live with its legacy, because it was the Yalta Conference that laid the foundation for the Cold War. It was the last conference of the big three, that's Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, before the end of the war. And it was going to be held in the Levadia Palace in Yalta in the Crimea. Now, the reason it was being held in Crimea was that Stalin was very reluctant to leave his own territory. Stalin, as he got older, got more and more paranoid, and he was terribly fearful of assassination plots and coups and revolutions and counter-revolutions. There is, in fact, no evidence at all that he was under any risk at all at this period. In fact, if anything, his status had been increased and improved by the fact that he'd managed Russia in the war, and Russia was clearly going to win the war. Nevertheless, he insisted that it had to be in Soviet territory, and it happened in the Crimea. The conference was held in the Vadia Palace, which you can see, and the American delegation was also accommodated in that palace in a separate wing. And of course, their accommodation was bugged. So all the discussions that the American delegation had before they went to the conference table, the Russians knew exactly what they were going to be looking for. The British were accommodated in a separate building, but their accommodation was bugged as well. So again, the Russians knew exactly what the two democratic parties were going to say and the attitudes they were going to take at the conference. At the time of the conference, the Red Army, the Soviet army, was poised to invade Germany. It was only 50 miles from Berlin. The British and the Americans, on the other hand, they were stalled 375 miles from Berlin. They had defeated the last German attempt to get something out of the war on the West, Wacht am Rhein, which was a spearhead aimed at Antwerp, trying to split the British and the Americans. And the British and the Americans had stopped that with difficulty. They had stopped it. The aim of the Yalta Conference was to decide the final course of the war and post-war arrangements. Back in Germany, the Germans were calling up the Volkssturm. Now, the Volkssturm was young boys and old men, too young or too old to have been called up to the German armed forces. They were given a very rudimentary military training, issued with Panzerfaust, that was a handheld anti-tank weapon, and sent off to the front. Now, although they are young boys and old men, and they've had very limited military training, these are Germans. So they're going to be a very tough nut to crack, nevertheless. Now, one of the reasons that the Germans kept on fighting right until the end, despite the fact that most Germans must have realized that actually they'd lost the war, was the fact that the Allies at their previous conference at Casablanca had said that only unconditional surrender would be acceptable. They would only allow the Germans to surrender, no conditions, no deal, nothing for them. And their view was, well, we might as well carry on fighting, because we're not going to get any worse terms than we would if we surrendered now. The big three, this clearly is a propaganda photograph of Stalin. He was the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USSR and also the Premier of Russia. So effectively, he's a dictator of the whole of the USSR. Roosevelt, FDR, he's in his fourth term as the President of the United States. Now, our American viewers will know, but our British viewers might not, that it was only in 1951 that the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution of the United States said that a president can only be voted into his office twice. So since then, a president has been limited to 2 terms, but it wasn't the case before that. Churchill, he's been the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom since 1940. So what did they all want from this conference at Yalta? Well, Stalin, he was 66 years of age at Yalta, and he wanted a buffer. He wanted a line of countries, territories that he controlled. He wanted buffer states to act as a buffer against invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, the Russians have always been xenophobic. They still are, with considerable reason, because Russia has been invaded so many times. The Mongols, the Tatars, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the French, the Germans have all invaded Russia, the Soviet Union, and therefore they want this line of buffers. And Stalin, in return, if the Allies, if the British and the Americans agreed to let him have a buffer, he would drop support for Western communist parties. Now, actually, that wasn't in any sense a great concession, because Western communist parties in the 2 countries that mattered, the UK and the USA, really were totally unimportant. There were 1 or 2 communists in each country, of course. There was a communist espionage ring in each country, but the communists were never going to be powerful. They were never going to be voted into government. They were never even going to be an effective bloc in parliament. So he wasn't actually offering very much. He initially wanted Germany to be split into smaller states. In other words, the pre-unification, pre-1870. The British, supported by the Americans, were against that. The British said, look, if you do that, if we put Germany back into the pre-unification mode of a whole lot of different states, all that will happen is that they will fight the wars of German unification all over again in an attempt to be united. So that will not happen. Stalin wanted to recover the Russian Empire. He wants the Baltic states back, and he wants territory that had been Russian in the Far East. He is intending, although of course he doesn't say it at Yalta, he intends ethnic cleansing. Now, in the Crimea, the Tatars had collaborated with the Germans, and Stalin was intending to exile them all to Siberia, which of course is what he eventually did. Some of them started to come back after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if he wants this buffer, Poland is the keystone. And when the Warsaw Rising happened in August 1944, what was known as the Home Army, the Polish Home Army, and the resistance movement in Poland. And their view was, if we, the Poles, play a part in the liberation of our own country, then we'll have a fairly strong hand in negotiations after the war. And the Red Army was poised just across the Vistula, just about to invade Poland. And the Polish Home Army rose, and the Soviet army stopped and didn't move. And when the British asked the Russians to allow the Royal Air Force to use air bases in Soviet-controlled territory, the Soviets said no. And the Soviet view was, let the Germans kill all the possible resistors. Let the Germans deal with any opposition to foreign domination or foreign occupation. And if they do, it means that when we come in, there'll be nobody to resist us. And of course, as you know, the Warsaw Rising was put down very bloodily by the Germans. So what does Roosevelt want? Well, Roosevelt, he was 63 at Yalta. He was the architect of the New Deal. He recognized, his government recognized the USSR in 1933. Now, the United Kingdom had recognized the Soviet Union in 1920. So why the difference? And the difference is this, that the United Kingdom and the United States have different criteria for recognizing a government. The United Kingdom recognizes a government de facto. In other words, the United Kingdom says, if you are in control of the country, we will recognize you, however unpleasant you may be, however much we may dislike you. If you control the country, as far as we're concerned, you're the government. The United States take a different view. They say we will recognize de jure. In other words, if you are the rightful government of the country, we will recognize you. And they did not recognize the Bolsheviks after the Bolshevik Revolution and after the Russian Civil War. They did not recognize the communists, the Bolsheviks, as being the rightful government of the USSR. So they didn't recognize the USSR until 1933. Now, Roosevelt, he'd had polio as a young man. And by 1945, he's got bronchitis, he's got hypertension, he's got sinus problems, he's got a large heart. He's a very heavy smoker. And although, of course, he didn't know it then, 2 months later, 2 months after the conference, he'd be dead. He was the man who brought the United States into the war. Politically, although his relationship with the British were extremely good on a personal level, and he got on very well with Churchill, he and Churchill were genuine friends. Politically, he was anti-colonialist. He believed in self-determination for everybody. His view was that the British Empire was a competitor with the United States for trade. So if the British Empire dissolved, then the newly independent countries would cleave to the United States, to, of course, the advantage of the United States. That's not, of course, what happened, but that's what he thought would happen. He genuinely believed in spreading democracy and the brotherhood of man. He really did genuinely believe that. Now, we might think that he was being rather naive, but it was a genuine belief. And he didn't like the British policy of spheres of influence and secret diplomacy. He had extended Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, and it was American Lend-Lease and the British convoys over the Arctic that contributed a huge amount to Soviet prosecution of the war, particularly the wheeled vehicles from General Motors, thousands of them, and aircraft from the British and all the rest of it. Would they have been on the winning side without it? Probably yes, but it would probably have taken an awful lot longer and an awful lot more casualties. And one always has to remember the Soviet Union lost 20% of her population in this war. So Lend-Lease from America was very, very important. He also hoped that he could get the Soviet Union into the Far East War against Japan. As we know, that didn't happen until very, very late. The height of opportunism, actually, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan after the 2 atom bombs had been fallen, and just a couple of weeks before Japan surrendered. Roosevelt did trust Stalin. He said, if you want to get a friend, you've got to be a friend. And when the British or Churchill said, don't trust Stalin, don't trust the Soviets, you cannot trust them, Roosevelt felt that that was just the British being devious. Winston Churchill, he was over 70 at Yalta. As a politician, of course, he'd turned his coat twice. He'd started off as a conservative, then became a liberal, then a conservative again. He wasn't terribly well at Yalta. His health was not particularly good. He probably knew he was going to lose the general election, which was due in July 1945. And as you know, of course, he did lose that election. A great orator and very conscious of the importance of ties with the United States. Of course, his mother was American, and he knew right from the beginning, right from 1939, that he hoped that the United States would join the war, but if they didn't, at least he could keep them neutral in Britain's favor, which of course was what happened. And then Roosevelt, in fact, brings the United States into the war, 1941. Churchill's aim was the traditional British policy of a balance of power in Europe, where no one power should be allowed to dominate the continent. Churchill wanted an independent Poland because he saw that as a buffer against the USSR. He also wanted a strong France. He wanted to restore France as a nation to contain Germany. Globally, of course, he wanted to maintain the British Empire. Now, as far as Europe was concerned, the British had centuries of involvement in Europe trying to maintain the balance of power, but they're now too weak to do it alone. They needed the United States with them. The great weakness of the Western approach to Yalta, the United States and the United Kingdom, was they had no common agenda. Churchill and Roosevelt both staged in Malta on the way to Yalta. The British wanted to discuss the common agenda. Roosevelt didn't. Roosevelt was very happy to have social interaction, and there were lots of parties. Didn't want to discuss business. And the result was that the democratic countries, the UK and the US, really they were playing a very weak hand when they got to Yalta, because they did not know what the other side wanted. So perhaps if there'd been a common agenda, things might, I emphasize, might have been a little bit better. So at Yalta, the Soviets have been dissuaded from insisting on Germany being reduced to its pre-unification smattering of states. And it's agreed that the country will be divided initially into 3 zones. The Russians would occupy the east, the British would occupy the northwest, and the Americans would occupy the southwest. Down here, Austria is also being occupied. That's the British bit of Austria. And then there's the question of the French. Now, the French had absolutely nothing to do with winning the war. They'd surrendered in 1940. And when the question of giving the French a zone came up, the Soviets were totally against it. They said, perfectly reasonably, We don't see any reason for the French to have a zone. The Americans were anti it as well at first. The British wanted it because they want to recreate France, reinstate France as a power, as I've said, as a buffer to any resurgent Germany. And the British say, well, all right, we'll give them a bit of our zone. And then eventually the Americans said, well, okay, they can have a bit of ours as well. So that's the French zone, that bit off to the west. Berlin, that's going to be divided as well. The Berlin, of course, being the capital of Germany, and the Russians are going to occupy the east bit of Berlin. The French will have a zone in the north, the British will be in the middle, and the Americans will be in the south. I spent 2 years stationed in Berlin when the war was up, and we all used to go to the French Economat, equivalent of the NAFE shop for armed forces, and they had a wonderful selection of wines and cheese, so we all bought our wines and our cheeses from there. And people went to the British NAFE to buy things like Yorkshire pudding and sausages and bacon, and we all went to the American PX to buy things like hamburgers. Now, hamburger now is universal, but in those days, the Brits didn't really know what hamburgers were. And a lot of us had our first hamburger by buying it in the American PX. They also sold very good steak. And funnily enough, if you wanted to buy a bicycle, the American PX was the place to go. Back in Germany, I've said that Germany was divided into 3 zones. The Netherlands up here annexed 27 square miles of German territory, which the West Germans bought back from the Netherlands in 1957. The French were allowed to occupy the Saarland. Now that's the bit opposite Luxembourg. And they did that until 1956, when there was a plebiscite to the inhabitants saying, do you want to be French or do you want to go back to be Germany? And of course, they went back to be German. The importance of the Saarland, of course, was part of Germany's industrial belt. As far as reparations are concerned, the Russians would have liked reparations. They would have liked to make Germany pay for the whole cost of the war. The British were very opposed to that, supported by the Americans. And the British said, look, after the First World War, Germany was forced to pay huge financial reparations, which she could not possibly afford, never did afford, was never able to pay it. And it was that, one of the factors, only one, that explained the rise of extreme nationalism in Germany and therefore the Second World War. So they were opposed to reparations as such. The Russians dismantled any bit of machinery that they could find in Germany, and a lot of the German machinery, of course, was better than what was in the USSR, and they shipped it back to the USSR, mainly to Russia. And they were intending to use forced labor in East Germany, as indeed they did. Much later, when West Germany could afford it, they did make cash grants to Poland and to the countries that they had occupied, or that Germany had occupied in the Second World War. And a codicil to the payment was, that's it. You know, don't come back and ask for more. That's it. And they all signed up to that. Now, you may know that at the moment, Greece is trying to screw more money out of Germany, largely because Greece is broke. And of course, the Germans are saying, no, you said that was that, you know, one payment, that was it. I very much doubt if Greece will succeed in getting any money out of Germany, but it's one to watch. I think it's an interesting little vignette of what's going on at the moment. The British and the Americans didn't dismantle German industry. Indeed, under the Marshall Plan, named after its instigator, General Marshall, which the aim of being to bring Germany back into the family of nations. And very quickly, of course, once the Cold War starts, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, to have West Germany as a member of NATO and assisting in the defense of the West, that's not something that they're thinking about in Yalta. But there is a view, the British and the Americans, bring at least West Germany back into the family of nations. Therefore, we won't destroy their industry. We will assist them to get industry going again. What we did take, both the British and the Americans, was intellectual property and scientists. Now, of course, as you know, it was German scientists who'd been working on the V2 missile that got America to the moon. As far as the Soviets were concerned, they had large numbers of German prisoners of war who'd been captured. And instead of releasing them, as the British and the Americans did, they kept them for 10 years and they worked them. When they eventually released their German prisoners in 1955, 50% of them had died. Malnutrition, disease, ill treatment, and only 50% survived. They also agreed at Yalta to set up the United Nations. And this would be a supranational body whose aim would be to resolve conflict. But instead of countries going to war with each other, they could take their problem to the United Nations and it would be resolved. Now, previous to the war, the League of Nations, of course, had been a failure, largely because the United States didn't join it, because the United States were concerned that if they did join a supranational body, that might involve them in the worst case, in wars they didn't want to be part of, or make them party to decisions that they didn't agree with. So they didn't join. So the idea of setting up the United Nations, the Americans were wary, but prepared to give it a go. The Soviets initially were against, because the League of Nations, of course, had expelled the Soviets as a result of the Winter War, the Soviet-Finnish War in the winter of 39-40. So the way to get around that was to establish a Security Council that would have permanent members, and the permanent members would be the UK, the US, and the USSR, and they would have a veto. So if the General Assembly, which is all the other countries of the world, independent countries of the world, came up with something that any of the permanent members of the Security Council didn't like, they could veto it, and that would be that. And that mollified Soviets, so they agreed to join. So initially, those three were the permanent members, and then France was added to it as a permanent member of the Security Council, largely at the British instigation, and China. Now, this was not the China of Mao Zedong. When Yalta Conference was held, the Chinese Civil War was still going on. Mao Zedong and the communists did not gain control of the whole of China until 1949. This is the China that eventually ends up in Formosa, or Taiwan. This is the Kuomintang. This is Chiang Kai-shek's China, Taiwan. And they are permanent members of the Security Council right up until 1971. And it's not until President Nixon goes to China where he begins the process of bringing China out of the cold. And eventually it's communist China that takes the place of Taiwan on the Security Council. And of course, it's communist China today, the People's Republic of China, that are the permanent members. Well, that seemed to be okay. And then the Soviets raised the question of the membership of the General Assembly. And they said, hang on, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they're British dominions. You control them. So how can they be members? If they're going to be members, then all our republics ought to be members. And the British said, no, we don't control them. Yes, the king is the king of Canada and of Australia and of New Zealand and of other territories as well. But they are independent countries with their own government. We don't control them. And the Soviets said, no. If they're going to be members, our republics have got to be members as well. So it was eventually agreed that that was what could happen. So you got places like Belarus and Ukraine that were Soviet socialist republics, all being members of the General Assembly, supposedly as independent countries, which of course they weren't. And it did give the Soviets quite a strong voting bloc in the General Assembly. Now, I've said that Poland was the keystone for what Stalin wanted as a buffer to protect against invasion of Russia. And of course, the British had gone to war for Poland in 1939, and they'd given refuge to the Polish government, which was in exile in London. And there were 150,000 Polish troops fighting under British command in this war. There were Poles fighting for the British, the Americans, the Russians, and indeed for the Germans. The Poles are very good smackers, so it's jolly useful to have them in NATO. And the trouble is that historically they've rather tended to smack the Russians and the Germans at the same time. And if you're sitting between the two school bullies, it might be advisable not to annoy them both at the same time. But the Soviet Union had fallen out with the Polish government in exile in London because of Katyn. Now, in April 1943, the Germans found at a place called Katyn, they uncovered a mass grave. And in this mass grave, initially, they found 6,000 bodies, mostly in uniform, mainly officers, not entirely, hands tied behind their back and a hole in the back of the head. And they thought, we're going to get blamed for this. So they stood off and they called in the International Red Cross. And the International Red Cross conducted a very detailed forensic examination of these bodies. And they came to the conclusion, a firm conclusion, by examination of the bodies, by looking at letters on the bodies, at bits of newspaper, all that sort of stuff, that they had actually all been shot in the spring of 1940. Now, what happened in the spring of 1940? Well, of course, you will know that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed between the foreign minister of the Soviet Union and the foreign minister of Germany in August 1939, just before the war starts. They agreed, one of the secret clauses was that at some time in the future, Germany and Russia would divide Poland between them. So when the Germans invaded in 1939, so did, a few weeks later, so did the Russians. On the 17th of September, in came the Russians, and they partitioned Germany between them. And Katyn was in the Russian zone. So the murder of these Russians was carried out by the Soviets. And the Polish government in exile in London protested vociferously to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union said, absolute nonsense, not done by us, this was the Germans. And they broke off relations with the Polish government in exile, and they set up their own communist Polish government in exile, which they called the Lublin government. The Soviets maintained right throughout, right up until Gorbachev, who finally admitted that, yes, the Soviets did do it. It wasn't the Germans. But for a long time, they insisted that it was the Germans. And of course, at the end of the war, they are occupying Poland. And therefore, it's a communist government that is set up. Now, again, at Yalta, it was agreed that Poland would lose territory to the Ukraine, which would be this territory here, and they would gain from Germany. So they gain East Prussia and some of Pomerania. What, of course, wasn't discussed at Yalta, but what actually happened at the end of the war, there was immediately ethnic cleansing within Poland. There were a lot of ethnic Germans living in Poland. They'd been there for centuries, and they were all kicked out unceremoniously. Out you go with what you can carry. And so there's a huge shift of people, mainly, first of all, into East Germany. The East Germans couldn't cope with them, didn't want them. A lot of them end up in the West. And for years, these people, known as DPs, displaced persons, were wandering around Europe trying to find a home. One of the sad things of it was that, of course, not only this is Germans kicked out of Poland, but an awful lot of Poles who had fought under British command couldn't go back to Poland because Poland was now communist. And if they went back, they would have been seen as anti-communist. They would have been locked up, or they might even have been shot. And one of the sad things was when I was a second lieutenant on a course at the School of Infantry in Warminster, my batman, the man who polished my boots and made my bed, had been a captain in the Polish army. And he wasn't swinging the lead. I mean, he didn't speak much English, but he showed me photographs of himself. He was a Polish officer. That's what he was reduced to. On the other side of the coin, of course, a lot of Polish officers who spoke English were able to transfer to the British army. And to this day, two of my personal friends are major generals of the British army with unpronounceable names, who, of course, were the sons of Poles who transferred to the British army. They were educated in England. They went to Sandhurst, became officers in the British army, and they're now major generals. So that was the sort of the good side of it. So the Allies did not get their independent Poland, and to this day, the Poles still accuse us of betraying them. They say, you betrayed us at Yalta. You let the communists take over. Well, the reply to that is, what do you expect us to do? Possession is 9/10 of the law as far as the Soviets are concerned. They are there. They're in Poland. They're in Czechoslovakia. They're in Hungary. They're in Romania. They're in Bulgaria. They're in the Baltic states. The only way we could get them out is by going to war with them. And that is not going to happen. Now, General George Patton, commanding the American Army of Occupation in their zone of Germany, said frequently and publicly to anybody who would listen, let's rearm the Wehrmacht, and they and we and the British will march on Moscow. Well, that was never going to happen, clearly. And if Patton hadn't been killed in a car crash, President Truman would have had to sack him. You'll hear all sorts of conspiracy theories about Patton was actually assassinated. He was shot personally by Donovan, the head of the OSS. That's rubbish. He was killed in a car crash, perfectly normal car crash. It wasn't set up by the OSS or anything else. But it was perhaps fortunate in that, as I say, you could not have the commander, the American commander, saying that loudly and publicly. So he would have had to have been sacked. But actually, he was killed in a car crash anyway. The other thing that was agreed at Yalta was that as far as possible, the damage done to Germany, bombing damage, would be repaired. Now, the Soviets couldn't care less about the occupants of East Germany, but obviously they did want to get East German industry going to a point, because, of course, it would help the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't want to spend any of their funds resurrecting East Germany. And from the point of view of the British and the Americans, they wanted West Germany to be restored. So a lot of this bomb damage is going to have to be repaired, and that was agreed at Yalta. I suppose the bombing that we remember most, certainly in the UK and probably in America as well, is the bombing of Dresden. And we are accused of a war crime. People say, how could you possibly destroy this lovely medieval city 3 months before the end of the war? How could you? Well, what had happened was that the Soviet Union asked the British to bomb Dresden. And the reason they asked the British to do that is that Dresden was on the main supply route to the Eastern Front. So it was where German reinforcements, German supplies went up through Dresden to get to the Eastern Front. It also had a number of factories that made optical instruments for tanks, artillery, rangefinders, that sort of stuff. So just a few days after the Yalta Conference, 13th to the 15th of February 1945, the RAF, assisted by the United States Army Air Force, dropped 4,000 tons of bombs on Dresden. And there was a firestorm, 25,000 people were killed. It actually took the Germans less than a week to get industrial production back to what it was before the raid. So how could we do that 3 months before the end of the war? Well, first of all, we didn't know it was 3 months before the end of the war. The British and Americans had not yet got across the Rhine. The V2s, the ballistic missile to which there was no defence, was still falling on London and on other liberated European cities. So it seems to me that Dresden was a perfectly legitimate military target. Now, you might say, and this was raised when people were setting up the preparation for the Nuremberg trials, the Geneva Convention says you must not target civilians deliberately. And you have done that. You, the Royal Air Force, United States Army Air Force, the Luftwaffe, you've all been bombing cities. That's a war crime. Why did they bomb cities? Because the technology to hit military targets simply did not exist. It would have been wonderful if you'd only bomb bridges, or you'd only bomb railway stations, or you'd only bomb armament factories, you'd only bomb airfields. They simply couldn't do it. Now, we today are so accustomed to seeing a cruise missile going up the street, stopping at the traffic lights, turning left and hitting the target. Modern munitions, you indicate the target and go away, and the munition will find its own way to the target. That could not happen during the Second World War. Even at the end of the war, the bomb aimer in the aircraft looked out of the window. When he got to where he thought he should, he released his bombs. So very indiscriminate. And that is why all sides started bombing cities rather than trying to bomb specific targets, because if you bombed a city, well, at least you'll do some damage. What happened to the Far East? Well, the Russians declared war on the 9th of August, 1945. They declared war against Japan. Now, the two atom bombs on the 6th of August, Hiroshima, the atom bomb, and on the 9th of August, Nagasaki. And that was the day the Russians declared war against Japan. Japan then surrendered on the 15th of August. So this really was the height of opportunism. And of course, by doing that, they seized the whole of the Kuril Islands here, and they seized the southern bit of Sakhalin. Now, they'd lost the southern bit of Sakhalin to Japan after the Russia-Japanese War of 1904. Now, that's a war we'll talk about when we eventually get back onto the wonderful Golden Eagle, when we actually get to the area where the Russia-Japanese War happened. It's a fascinating war, I may say. Prisoners of war, this came up at Yalta. The Russians regarded their own prisoners as traitors. They said that if you've surrendered, you're a traitor. You've betrayed the motherland. You should never have surrendered. You should be killed rather than surrendered. Stalin's son was captured by the Germans, and the Germans offered to trade him for a number of German generals who'd been captured by the Russians, and the Russians said no. And the son committed suicide in the prison camp, and the son's wife, Stalin's daughter-in-law, was thrown into a gulag, into a concentration camp. That happened to the families of people who were taken prisoner. In addition, there were a large number of Russians in German uniform, at least 800,000, and there may have been more. Some people say there were 1 million Russians in German uniform, but there are at least 800,000 that I've been able to work out. Now, why on earth are they fighting for the Germans? Well, there were an awful lot of Russians who did not like communism and who did not like Stalin. The peasants objected to the concentration of their little farms, collective farming. They didn't like that. A lot of the factory workers didn't like the quota system in factories, where you were told what to make and that was it. You couldn't make any more and therefore make a bit more profit. And they didn't like that either. So when the Germans went into a prison camp and said, right, chaps, you are not entitled to the protection of the Geneva Convention because the USSR has never ratified it. So you can stay in a prison camp and you won't be eating the best of food, or you could join our crusade against Bolshevism and you'll get a nice uniform, 3 meals a day and a salary. And of course, lots of them were prepared to sign up for that. The Russian Liberation Army, as it was known, was headed, at least as a figurehead, by a man called General Vlasov. Now, Vlasov was a Russian general who'd been captured outside Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it now is. And one of the things that was agreed at Yalta was that any nationals wearing enemy uniform were to be repatriated. So the Russians insisted that all these chaps in German uniform should be repatriated to Russia. And of course, a lot of them were executed out of hand, the rest slung in the gulag. You might say, why did the British and Americans agree to that? Well, the British had to agree it because there were a large number of British prisoners of war in German prison camps. And these prison camps had been overrun by the Soviets. And it was made fairly clear, although it was never said explicitly, but it was made fairly clear that the quid pro quo for the Soviets sending those British prisoners back, and to a lesser extent American prisoners back, depended on the British agreeing to the Russians being repatriated. So that is what happened. One of the reasons that these Russians continue fighting for the Germans right to the bitter end, and some of them were at Omaha, which you will know was the largest bloodbath of the Normandy landings, was of course that they knew jolly well that if they were repatriated, that was it. That was the end. So at the end of the Yalta Conference, then, what happens? Well, the Iron Curtain comes down all over Europe, right up from the Arctic, down through the Baltic states, Poland, eastern half of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all the way down. And the Cold War begins. Could we have got more if the Americans and the British had agreed a common agenda? Could we have persuaded Stalin to give way? Because Stalin knew exactly what he wanted and he got most of it. I don't think we could. Possession's 9 points of the law. The Russians were there. They were occupying that country. They weren't going to go away. And I think we had a very weak hand, and I don't think we were going to be able to do anything about it. One has to have some sympathy with the Russians when you remember that they lost, and I've said this before, 20% of their population in the war. And Stalin wanted to make very sure that if there was ever another war, there was an awful lot of non-Russian territory that would have to be covered first. So that's the story of the Yalta Conference, the start of the Cold War. And in my next talk, I'm going to talk about the Cold War itself, which of course goes on from the end of the Second World War, really right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So thank you very much indeed for listening. And I hope I will see some of you on the wonderful Golden Eagle when we at last get back to it. But thank you for listening.
Absolutely. We're very much looking forward to having you back, Gordon, on board the Golden Eagle train, which for those of you who would like to travel with us next year and haven't booked, I'm delighted to say that Major Corrigan is joining us on a number of different departures on the Golden Eagle Trans-Siberian Express and the Silk Road journeys next year. So please, if you have any interest in those tours, then please let us know and we will let you know what departures that Major Corrigan is travelling with us on. So thank you very much for another wonderful presentation there, Major Corrigan. And I do welcome anyone to send through any questions that they have. As you were saying, obviously there's a second part to this lecture series, which is the Cold War, and that is scheduled on the 30th of March, which I think is a Tuesday. And it's at a slightly later time of 7 p.m. in the UK. And the earlier times, obviously in the States, we've got, it's 11 a.m. 11 a.m. Pacific time and I think 2 p.m. Eastern time. Sorry, I get confused quite a lot with time zones, but that's where we are. So it'd be great for you to join us. So thank you for those who are sending through some comments now. I did have one question actually before the come through before the talk, Gordon. I don't know if you've been to this particular area in Moscow, but just asking about the Bunker 42 Museum in Moscow, and I wondered if you'd been, and if you had been, would it be worth a visit in your opinion?
One of the things the Russians do incredibly well is their military museums. Any Russian military museum is well worth seeing. We do actually on the Trans-Siberian visit several. The best one in Moscow, and I know the one you're talking about, the best one is actually the Museum of the Soviet Armed Forces, still call it Soviet, and it's brilliant. I mean, it's quite interesting because, and I've been there several times because it's the sort of place you can't see it all in one day. There is in the Museum of the Soviet Armed Forces, there's a huge amount about the Napoleonic Wars, because of course the Russians were on the winning side of the Napoleonic Wars, and there's a huge amount about that. And then there's hardly anything on the First World War, hardly nothing. And then you go into the Second World War, the huge amount about Stalingrad and the Second World War. And I asked the curator, I said, why nothing about the First World War? And he said, well, remember, this is Soviet. I mean, they weren't Soviets during the Napoleonic War. He said this is, and of course, as far as the Soviets were concerned, the First World War was an imperialist war, and therefore they skip over that. Whereas the Second War is the great patriotic war. To the Russians, the Napoleonic Wars are the patriotic war. That's what they refer to it as. And the Second World War is the great patriotic war. But my advice to your questioner is any Russian military museum is well worth going to. They're frankly much better. I mean, I hate to say it, but they're much better than anything you see in the West in scale, if nothing else. I mean, if you're interested in Soviet tanks, there are a number of their museums, and one we do look at on the Trans-Siberian, and it's got a model of every single tank ever invented in the world. right up to, I don't think they've got the T-90 because the T-90 is still in service, but they've got everything up to that. And of course, the T-90 is going to be replaced by the Armata, so that'll be in it there. But I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. And we also visit a railway museum where there is every type of railway engine, you know, ever invented. So, sorry, it's a very long answer to a very simple question. Answer: yes. Go to museum. Well worth a visit. Any Russian military museum, if you're interested in that, well worth a visit.
And the Museum of Soviet Armed Forces you mentioned, is that in Moscow, did you say?
Yeah, it's about when I last went, and I walked from our hotel, the hotel that we always stay in, and I deliberately walked because I wanted to see a bit more of Moscow, and it took me half an hour or so to walk there. It's in Moscow. I mean, you could get a taxi, but it's terrific, and they have a large number of museums. I mean, what they're doing, they will tell you, you know, we're trying to sort out our history. One Russian historian said to me when I asked him about Irkutsk. Now we go to Irkutsk on the Trans-Siberian. It's a city right in the middle of Siberia. And you walk up Karl Marx Alley and you cross Lenin Prospect. And there's a great statue of Admiral Kolchak. Now, Admiral Kolchak was the leader of the White Russians in the Russian Civil War. So I said to my Russian chum, well, how do you square, what's this? I mean, Kolchak and Lenin are totally opposed. And he said, well, we are a country with an unpredictable past. You know, most countries have an unpredictable future. And he said, look, I've learned one history under Stalin. I said another under Khrushchev, another under Gorbachev, and he said I'm learning another under Putin. So they're trying to come to terms with the history, but they're doing it very, very well. You know, they spend a lot of time, a lot of money. Their curators are generally multilingual. They produce an excellent sort of you know, manual which explains all the exhibits, and you can get one in English, and it costs peanuts. Any Russian museum, well worth going to.
Well, that's good to know for anyone that's obviously planning to travel to Russia at any point, with whether it's with us or independently. It's worth certainly including those within your itinerary. We have another question here from Ian Singh, who's just asked that he's interested in why Stalin wanted Kaliningrad as part of the USSR and not transferred to Poland.
Yeah, the reason that they wanted Kaliningrad was that the headquarters of the Baltic Fleet was in St. Petersburg or Leningrad, and that is not ice-free. It freezes up in the winter. Kaliningrad doesn't, it's ice-free. And they wanted Kaliningrad so they could shift the Baltic Fleet to Kaliningrad. So to this day, Kaliningrad is the headquarters of the Baltic Fleet because it doesn't freeze up in winter. And that's why they insisted on hanging on, or in fact annexing. And Kaliningrad became part of Russia and still is. And there are various rights to allow people to cross it. But that's why they wanted it. Ice-free port, headquarters of the Baltic Fleet, which it still is.
We have another question here from Omar, who's just asked, the Iron Curtain border is different from that agreed at Yalta. Is this because the Soviets were allowed, due to numbers, cross over and occupy a large part of Europe?
Well, they were already in occupation of large parts of Europe when the war came to an end. I mean, we hadn't got as far as Berlin. We got as far as the Elbe, and that was it. So they're already there. And of course, they are saying, oh, no, my dear chap, the government of Hungary, nothing to do with us. It is the people of Hungary who happen to be communists, running it. And Poland, it's not us. Yeah, we're occupying it for the moment, but it's a free Polish government, and it's a free Czechoslovak government, and it's a free Romanian government. Well, of course, it wasn't. It was a communist government put there by the Soviets. But they are saying, we haven't laid down this border. I mean, this is the border of these countries. These are free countries. We've liberated them. So that was their attitude, and that's why the the Iron Curtain is where it is. That's why that border is where it is.
Let's just see if we've got any more questions before we finish. We've got one here from Jean-Claude, who's I think asking about why Russians were much better than the Western side of things in the war. I assume that's that question's referring to in this section that you spoke about.
I'm not sure that they were better militarily. Of course, the first year of the war, I mean, they were appalling because Stalin had said you may not surrender, and the Germans simply ran rings out of them. And the reason the Germans lose on the Eastern Front really is because they are trying to hold a front that's 2,000 miles north to south. The reason part of the reason they lose Stalingrad, again, is political. The German army said, we don't need to capture Stalingrad. We just mask it and carry on. What they wanted in 1942 was to get to the oil down in the Caucasus. That's what they want to do. Hitler insists that Stalingrad, because it's called Stalingrad, used to be called Tsaritsyn before the Russian Revolution, must be captured. And the German army wasn't trained for sieges. They didn't like doing sieges. The German army was trained to maneuver, to react. And if you're surrounded, as of course they were after Operation Uranus, when the Russians surrounded the Stalingrad pocket, they weren't too worried initially. They said, well, we break out, concentrate, counterattack. And it was Hitler who said, you may not, you stay there. So there was, a whole German army, the 6th German Army and part of the 4th Panzer Army were written off because of Stalingrad. And again, it was numbers. German population, 40 million, perhaps 50 odd million with Austria. Russian population, I think it was 280 million, something like that. So it's population. It's the fact that the Germans are having to fight on 2 fronts, which traditionally they always tried to avoid. It's the Lend-Lease, the stuff that's coming in from America. So they're not better. The Russian soldier is not better than the German soldier, or better than the British soldier, better than the American soldier. It's just there's a hell of a lot more of them. And they are being equipped very much by the West. And the Germans, brilliant soldiers though they were, they simply can't hold that front. I mean, when during the Cold War, we in the British Army, and I've no doubt in the American Army as well, the people we wanted to talk to were German officers who'd been on the Russian front, because we used to say to them, look, you managed to hold them back right from 1943, 44, 45, and we may have to do the same thing if they come rolling across the Indo-German border. How did you do it? So really they were much better soldiers than the Russians, but the Russians had numbers on their side. Ultimately, of course, they had equipment on their side as well. So that's why they were able to achieve what they did achieve. And of course, remember the Allies, the British and Americans don't get into Europe until 1944, June 1944, the Normandy landings. And one of the reasons we do go back in Normandy, the Germans would still have lost the war had we never landed in Normandy, but the Russians would have got as far as the Channel, and who knows when they would have gone home. So part of Normandy, part of the thinking behind the Normandy landings is to make sure the Russians don't get too far into Europe.
Oh, well, thank you very much for answering that question. That's concludes the questions that we've been asked, and I just want to say thank you again for everyone who's joined us for today's lecture. Like I said, the next one will be on the 30th of March with Major Corrigan. We also have another lecture next week, which is a Central Asian themed history lecture presented by Sophie Ibbotson. So whichever lectures you can join us for, we would love to see you there. So wishing you a lovely day wherever you are, everyone, and thanks again to Gordon, and we'll see you all soon.